Bone-deep exhaustion doesn't care who you're standing next to. It doesn't care that the man who owns the entire South Harbor of Boston and every man who works in it is asleep one floor above. For 4 years, Maren Halloway had survived on 3 overlapping shifts, 3 hours of sleep a night, and a stack of medical bills she knew she would never finish paying. Her job was simple. Come down to the 40th floor at midnight, feed the files into the shredder, and never read them. She was paid not to read them. That night, in the middle of the records room, her knees finally gave out. She braced for cold concrete. She did not brace for waking hours later on the 42nd floor, a place she had never been permitted to enter. Her calloused fingers closed tight around the silver ring on the hand of a man who had ordered men killed. And the thing that turned her blood to ice wasn't that hand. It was that all night long, he never pulled it away. If Maren's story made you hold your breath even once, leave a like so I know you're still here. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, because the best part is still ahead. And if someone you know needs to hear this story tonight, pass it along to them. Maren woke for the second time, and this time she was fully awake. The ceiling was wrong. It wasn't the stained, crumbling plaster above her second-floor apartment, and it wasn't the row of flickering fluorescent lights in the storage room. It was high, white, and so clean that it looked as though no one had ever lived beneath it. She lay still, letting her mind slowly piece everything back together. Her knees, the concrete floor, the darkness. And then she realized her right hand wasn't resting on top of the blanket. She turned her head very slowly, the way people turn when they already know they aren't going to like what they're about to see. Cormac Rourke was sitting in an armchair that had been pulled close to the edge of the bed. He was still wearing the same shirt from the night before, the collar open, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. His head rested against the back of the chair, his chin angled slightly downward, and he was asleep. His left hand lay open on the blanket. Maren's fingers were closed around it. She didn't remember doing that. She pulled her hand away, and she moved too quickly, and the soft rustle of fabric in that silent room sounded as loud as something breaking. His eyes opened. There was no confusion in them, no slow blinking from a man trying to find his way back into the world. He went from asleep to awake in a fraction of a second, and his first look landed directly on her face, sharp and complete, as though he'd never closed his eyes at all. Maren held the hand she had withdrawn against her chest. Her heart was beating somewhere near her throat. He said nothing. He looked at her hand, then at his own, still lying open on the blanket, then slowly curled his fingers and drew it back, like a man setting down something heavy. The silver ring on his little finger caught the first faint gray light of dawn. She cleared her throat. It felt dry as paper. You didn't call security. It wasn't a question, but she wanted it to be one. Cormac sat upright, rolled his neck once, and his vertebrae cracked with a dry, brittle sound. Security would have hauled you to your feet, dragged you down 40 floors, and left you sitting on the sidewalk, he said. His voice was rough, not because he had just woken up, but because it seemed to have always been that way. Then the service company would send someone else up this morning. That person would need 3 weeks to learn the routes, the door codes, what gets destroyed and what doesn't. I don't like replacing people, so I'm being kept because I know my way around. You can put it that way if you like. Maren pushed the blanket aside. She needed to leave this room. She needed somewhere with noise and other people. She needed anything that wasn't that look in his eyes. She lowered her feet to the carpet, stood, and the world tilted sideways. She didn't see him move. A hand had already closed around her elbow, catching her halfway down, and there was nothing gentle about it. He set her back on the edge of the bed, the way someone might straighten a chair that had been knocked out of place, then released her immediately. Stay seated, he said. I have to go to work. You passed out on the storage room floor, and I don't know how long you were lying there because no one goes down to the 40th floor after midnight except you. Do you know what would have happened if I hadn't gone down there looking for the shipping ledger last night? I would have woken up at 5 o'clock and gone to my next shift. Cormac looked at her for a long moment. Then he pulled his phone from his pocket, dialed a number, and held it to his ear. He never took his eyes off her face when he spoke. Pike. Maren Halloway. Night shift contract. 40th floor. Cancel every one of her shifts for the next 10 days. Full pay. If the service company has questions, tell them to call me. He ended the call before the person on the other end could answer, and tossed the phone onto the blanket. Maren could hear the blood rushing in her ears. You can't do that. I can't afford to take 10 days off. You don't understand. I have payments due on the 15th, and if I don't work, then... I just said you're being paid." He cut in. He didn't raise his voice. He hadn't raised it once since opening his eyes, and perhaps that was what made her fall silent. She sat there with both hands clenched together in her lap, hating that they were shaking. Over the past 4 years, she had learned many ways not to accept anything from anyone, because everything given came with a price, and that price was always collected when a person was at their weakest. She looked up at him. "I don't understand what you want." Cormac rose to his feet. He picked up the coat draped over the back of the chair, folded it across his arm, and walked toward the door. At the threshold, he stopped, but he didn't turn around. "You're something broken inside my building," he said. "I fix broken things." The door closed softly behind him, and Maren sat alone in the stark white room, staring down at the palm of her right hand, where the faint outline of a circle still remained. Belhaven Nursing Center stood on the western edge of the city, a 3-story red brick building with a parking lot that always seemed far too large for the number of cars inside it. Maren took the number 7 bus, got off at the final stop, and walked the rest of the way, just as she had done every Tuesday and Saturday afternoon for the past 4 years. She signed the visitor log at the reception desk, accepted the plastic badge, and followed the second-floor hallway toward the last room at the end of the corridor. Room 214. She pushed open the door. Jonah lay in his usual position, the head of the bed raised at a moderate angle, his face turned toward the window. He could breathe on his own. He didn't need the machine to help him anymore, and that was what the doctors continued to call progress. And Maren had learned how to take from that word whatever small piece she needed to keep moving forward. He still couldn't speak. It had been 4 years. She pulled the plastic chair closer to the bed, sat down, and took the folded newspaper from her purse. It was a habit she had begun during those first weeks, when the nurses told her to keep familiar sounds around him, to speak to him as though he could hear. Maren didn't know whether he could hear or not. She only knew that if she stopped talking, the room would be left with nothing but the steady counting of the machines, and she couldn't bear that. She opened the newspaper and read the sports section first, because Jonah had always read the sports section first. The city's team had lost its 3rd game in a row. A coach had been fired. She even read the long, tedious commentary written by a columnist she found boring herself, simply because it filled another 3 minutes. Then she turned to the local news and read about a waterfront redevelopment project, a traffic jam in the tunnel, and the weekend weather. She read in her normal voice, not too gently, because Jonah had always hated being spoken to in a gentle voice. When she finished, she folded the newspaper and placed it on the bedside cabinet beside the plastic cup and a half-empty box of tissues. The top of the cabinet was bare. She had once brought photographs, but later she took them home again, because there were afternoons when she didn't have the strength to look at them. She stayed a while longer, holding her brother's hand, and told him that she had fainted in the storage room, that it had been ridiculous, and that she only needed to catch up on a little sleep and she would be fine. She didn't tell him the rest. She didn't tell him about the white room on the 42nd floor, about the man sitting in the armchair, or about the 10 days off she had never asked for. There were things she still didn't know how to name, and she didn't want to speak them aloud in this room. On her way out, she stopped at the financial office on the 1st floor, because she always stopped there, because avoiding it only made everything more expensive. The woman behind the desk recognized her immediately, and her expression was the expression of someone about to say something she had already been forced to say far too many times in her life. She opened the file, turned the screen around, and reminded Maren that the cost of care for the patient in room 214 was $9,000 a month, and that this month's payment was already 11 days overdue. She added that she was very sorry, that she was only following procedure, and that once the balance passed 30 days, the file would be transferred to another department. Maren nodded. She said she would find a way. She said it in the voice of someone who had spoken those words many times and had never completely lied, because every time she had found a way, somehow or another, through night shifts or weekend shifts, or by going without meals. The woman behind the desk nodded in return and didn't ask anything else. Perhaps she had heard those words many times too. Maren stepped back into the hallway and meant to walk straight to the exit. But when she reached the turn, she stopped. On the wall beside each door was a small plastic frame holding the patient's name card. She had passed it hundreds of times, but that afternoon she stopped and looked at it for a long time, at the white card with its neat black lettering, her brother's name, his date of birth, his room number. 4 years. She still hadn't grown used to seeing Jonah's name on a card like that. She thought of the 20-year-old brother who used to argue with her over who got to use the car first. The brother who left dirty shoes in the middle of the hallway and never remembered to close the refrigerator door. And she thought about how his name was now printed in an administrative typeface. Neat and clean. In the middle of a corridor where everything was neat and clean. She stood there until an orderly pushed a cart past and she had to move aside. Then she left, signed out, and returned the badge, and took the number 7 bus back home. That night, she returned to her apartment, cooked nothing, lay down in her clothes, and slept for 3 hours. It was a good night. The door to Cormac Rourke's office opened without a knock, and that was the only thing he needed to know who was walking in. The building had 42 floors, more than 300 employees, and exactly one person who was allowed to enter that way. Deirdre Kavanagh walked straight to his desk and dropped a file onto the wood. She didn't sit. She never sat when she brought him something she considered a waste of both their time. "You wanted to know about her, so here it is," she said. "I had people check 3 different sources. There's nothing." Cormac pulled the file closer and opened it. The first page was a copy of her identification. She looked younger in the photograph, her face fuller, without the dark circles he had watched through an entire night. He turned the page. Clean criminal record. No connection to the Zaleski family. No connection to anyone at the harbor. Employment contract through the service company, signed 4 years earlier. Financial records. A list of creditors. Her younger brother's medical file and the nursing care expenses continued onto the next page. He read every line, not quickly, while Deirdre stood waiting with the patience of a woman who had spent 30 years waiting for Rourke men to finish reading documents. "She works 3 jobs at once," Deirdre said. "The night shift here, an hourly job somewhere else, and on weekends, she answers phones for a small office. She hasn't taken a single day off in 14 months. That isn't loyalty, Cormac. It's arithmetic. She's subtracting her own life piece by piece to pay a debt that can never be paid off." Cormac didn't answer. He had reached the last page. He went back to the beginning and read through it a second time, more slowly, and this time he wasn't reading what was on the paper. He was reading what wasn't. Her father had died 4 years earlier. The file listed the cause as an accident connected to an industrial fire, followed by one brief line stating that he had been suspended from his position as a safety inspector after the investigation ended. That was all. There was no warehouse address, no name for the owner of the cargo stored there that night, no report number, no date, and there were no 2 words that anyone who had investigated records for 30 years would have written on the first page in bold letters and underlined, because they were the only thing that made the entire file important. Harbor Point. The name didn't appear anywhere. Cormac kept turning the pages at the same pace. He didn't stop, didn't look up, and didn't allow a single muscle in his face to move. Inside his chest, something very cold had just opened its eyes. He knew Harbor Point. He knew who had owned it that autumn, knew what had been stored in the warehouse, knew who had called whom during the week before it burned. He had lived with those things for 4 years, and he had learned how to keep them still. But now someone had taken a hand and brushed that name off the page, carefully and cleanly, and then handed the page to him. "Anything else?" he asked. Deirdre shrugged. "Nothing worth your time. She's a contract worker who had bad luck. This city has 10,000 people just like her." Cormac closed the file and pushed it aside. "Thank you," he said. "I'll look at it again later." Deirdre watched him for 1 second longer. She was the only person in the building who dared to watch him for 1 second longer. Then she turned away. "You should sleep," she said, with her hand already on the doorknob. "You look like your father did in his final year." The door closed. Cormac remained still. He kept his expression unchanged until the sound of her heels disappeared at the end of the hallway, and only then did he allow himself to breathe out. 30 years. She had been in that house since he was too short to see over the tabletop. She was the one who had taught him how to read a contract, how to count the people in a room before sitting down, how to know who was lying by listening to where they paused. She had stood beside his father's coffin and hadn't cried because she told him that people didn't cry in front of those waiting to see whether they were weak. In those 30 years, she had lied for him more times than he could ever know. She had never lied to him. Cormac sat for a very long time, both hands resting flat on the desk, staring at the file lying at an angle near the right corner. Outside, night had already fallen, and the lights from the southern harbor cast long, slow bands across the ceiling. Then he turned his chair, bent down, and opened the bottom drawer on the left. Beneath a layer of old papers, Inside a small, unlocked tin box, there was a key. He hadn't used it in 4 years. The call came on the 4th day of the 10 she wasn't permitted to work. Gerald Pike's voice on the other end was courteous and offered no explanation at all. He only said that a car would pick her up at 10 o'clock in the morning and that Mr. Rourke wanted to see her on the 42nd floor. Marin put on the best clothes she owned, a blouse she had washed by hand the night before, and sat through the entire ride with both hands resting on her knees. She had considered every possibility, being dismissed, being forced to sign something promising never to speak about what she had seen, being asked questions she had no answers for. She hadn't considered what actually happened. Cormac sat behind his desk in a clean shirt, the sleeves still rolled to his elbows. He didn't invite her to sit. He pushed a sheet of paper across the desk toward her and waited. Marin looked down. It was a paid-in-full statement issued by Ambrose Voss's debt collection company, with a red seal in the corner and a signature at the bottom. Her name appeared on the 3rd line. The amount of $240,000 was listed in the left column. In the right column, on the line marked remaining balance, there was a single 0. She didn't pick up the paper. She had learned long ago that miracles were only traps set by people with better leverage, and the more beautiful the bait looked, the deeper the hook went. She stood there staring at that 0 for a long time, until her vision blurred with something she refused to let fall. Then she looked up. "How much do I owe you?" "Exactly what I paid," Cormac said. "I don't charge interest, and I don't send men to knock on anyone's door. Then it's the same as before, only the creditor's name has changed." "No," he said, "and this is where you should sit down." Marin sat. Cormac opened a thin file and turned it so she could read. It was a long-term nursing care projection, with the Belhaven logo in the corner, her brother's name, and estimated costs extending not by the month but by the year, continuing through the length of a lifetime. "The old debt is finished," he said. "It's dead. But you and I both know that wasn't your problem. Your problem is that every month there will be another bill, and it will arrive on the 15th, and it will keep arriving until one of the 2 people in your family is no longer here. You can't work 3 jobs for 30 years. You proved that on the floor of my storage room." Marin felt a chill travel down her spine, and it didn't come from the air conditioning. She understood, slowly and clearly, that this man hadn't bought her past. He had bought her future, and there was no paid-in-full statement for that. "What do you want?" "A personal secretary," Cormac said. 42nd floor. Schedule, correspondence, files, doors. You decide who enters this office and who waits. You don't report to human resources. You don't report to building management. And you don't report to anyone except me. 3 times your current salary, and every expense at Belhaven transferred to the company account. You move to the 41st floor, the last apartment at the end of the hall. It's already furnished. I'm not a secretary. I destroy paperwork on the night shift. You've worked in this building for 4 years, and no one has ever complained about you once, he said. You know which floor keeps what. You know what can be destroyed and what can't, and you've never read a single page of it. I checked. That's something I can't buy with a degree. At that exact moment, the door opened without a knock, and Deirdre Kavanagh walked in. She looked at the paper on the desk, then at Marin, then at Cormac, and she didn't lower her voice even slightly. You can't do this, she said. Not this way. You bring an outsider onto the 42nd floor, let her guard the door to your office, let her sleep 1 floor away from you, and you do it after finding her unconscious on the floor. Do you know what people in this building are going to say? I don't care what people say. You should. Your father always did. Cormac looked up, and his voice didn't grow louder, but there was something in it that silenced the entire room. My father has been dead for 4 years, Deirdre. Deirdre stood still for a beat. Then she turned toward Marin, and for the first time she looked directly into her face, a long, level gaze with no hostility in it at all, which made it far more frightening. You understand what you're signing, don't you, Miss Halloway? I haven't signed anything, Marin said. Deirdre gave one small nod, then walked out and closed the door behind her. Cormac placed the contract in front of Marin with a pen. She picked it up and read. She read all of it, every line, including the fine print on the back, because over the past 4 years she had learned that the thing that killed you was always written on the back. There were no unusual clauses. Nothing bound her to stay. She could leave at any time with 2 weeks' notice. And that was what frightened her most, because it meant this man knew perfectly well that she wouldn't. She placed the pen on the final line and signed her name. She had traded one cage for another cage with a window. Everything Maren Holloway owned fit inside 2 canvas bags and 1 cardboard box. And it took her exactly 40 minutes to move out of the apartment where she had lived for 3 years. The last apartment at the end of the hallway on the 41st floor already had a bed, a wardrobe, and towels folded into neat squares in the bathroom. She set the cardboard box in the corner and didn't open it. On the first night, she pulled the wooden chair away from the writing desk and wedged its back beneath the doorknob. She did it without thinking, following the same instinct that had stayed with her through 4 years in places where locks couldn't be trusted. Then she lay down fully dressed, one hand resting on her chest, her eyes open, and waited. She knew what she was waiting for. No one gave anyone anything for free. That was the first thing the city had taught her after her father died, and it had taught her through lessons that never needed repeating. People paid her not to read, and she understood very well that when a man paid $240,000, what he bought couldn't possibly be only a schedule book and someone who knew how to close a door. There would be a knock. Maybe not tonight. Maybe after a week. After a month. Once she had grown used to warm blankets and begun to forget where she was, then there would be a knock and a voice on the other side of the door, and the real price would finally be spoken aloud. On the second night, she left the chair where it was. She had worked all day, had learned how to use Cormac's scheduling system, had learned that he didn't eat lunch, that he answered emails at 4 o'clock in the morning, that 3 telephone numbers were allowed to be connected directly, and every other call had to go through her. He told her exactly what needed to be said, and not one word more. He didn't look at her longer than necessary. In the evening, when she left the office, he was still sitting there, and the desk lamp cast light across one half of his face. On the third night, she lay awake listening to the elevator moving through the center of the building, counting how many times it stopped, telling herself that if it stopped on the 41st floor, she would know. It didn't stop. On the 4th night, she dreamed of the storage room and the cold concrete floor, and she woke at 3 o'clock in the morning with her heart pounding. She sat upright in the darkness and stared at the door for 20 minutes until she was certain no one was outside. On the 5th night, she realized she hadn't checked the lock before lying down, and she sprang up to check it, and she hated herself for doing so. On the 6th night, she left the chair in its proper place beside the writing desk. She lay down, waited for the familiar fear to rise, and it didn't. By the 7th night, she understood, and what she understood made her colder than everything she had feared during the 6 nights before it. She lay in the darkness and went back through every day, one by one. He hadn't touched her once. He hadn't stood closer than necessary once. He hadn't asked a single question about her private life, hadn't mentioned that night again, hadn't given any sign that he was waiting to be repaid for anything. For 7 days, that man had treated her exactly as an employer treated an employee, nothing more. And that was the problem. Because if he wanted something from her, she would know where she stood. She would know the price, know how to pay it, know how to live with it, just as she had lived with everything else. But a man who spent that much money, erased a debt she had dragged behind her for 4 years, and then asked for nothing, left only 2 possibilities. Either what he wanted was so great that it wasn't time to name it yet, so great that he had to wait until she trusted him enough, grew accustomed enough, became trapped enough, or he hadn't bought anything from her at all. He was paying another debt, to someone else, for something else. And somehow, she was merely the place where that debt was being paid. Maren lay still for a long time with that thought. It touched a place inside her that she had sealed shut long ago, a place that still held the sound of a telephone ringing at midnight 4 years earlier, and a voice asking whether she was a relative of Mr. Emmett Holloway. She didn't allow herself to follow that thought any further. She sat up, went to the writing desk, poured herself a glass of water, and drank it all while looking through the window toward the southern harbor, where the cranes stood in a row beneath the yellow lights, and nothing moved. Then she returned to the bed and pulled the chair away from the writing desk once more. But this time she didn't wedge it beneath the doorknob. She placed it beside the bed and hung her coat over its back, the way people did in a room where they intended to stay. It was the most foolish thing she had ever done. Maren's desk stood halfway down the corridor on the 42nd floor, between the elevators and the wooden door leading into Cormac's office, and she realized very quickly that its position wasn't accidental. Everyone who wanted to see him had to pass through her first. By the 2nd week, she had learned the names of 23 people, and she had learned that 19 of them deliberately avoided looking her in the face. Deirdre Kavanagh did the opposite. She began passing Marin's desk more often than necessary. Not every day, and never during the busiest hours, but often enough for Marin to recognize a pattern. She slowed as she walked by, glanced down at the desktop to see what Marin was arranging, then continued on. There was no hostility in it. Nothing in that gaze demanded a response from her. It was the way someone looked at a new crack in the wall of their own house, still small, not yet in need of repair, but already marked and remembered. By Thursday of that week, Deirdre stopped for real. She placed a hot paper cup of coffee on Marin's desk, the kind with a lid, bought from the shop in the lobby. "People forget you've been sitting here since 7 o'clock, she said. "Everyone on this floor thinks they're the busiest person in the building." Marin thanked her and didn't drink it. Deirdre didn't appear to notice. She stood there with one hand resting on the edge of the desk and began talking about things that were entirely harmless. She asked whether Marin had grown used to the scheduling system, asked whether she knew the hot water dispenser in the break room had been broken since the previous month and no one had bothered to report it, and told her that she had worked in this building since before the 42nd floor was finished, when the floor was still bare concrete. Marin answered briefly and politely, enough not to seem rude. She had lived long enough to know that the most pleasant conversations were often the ones with a purpose. "Do you live alone?" Deirdre asked. "Yes. Is there no one else in the city?" "I have a younger brother." Deirdre nodded, and she didn't ask his name, didn't ask his age, didn't ask what he did. "And your parents?" "My mother died when I was 12, Marin said. "My father died 4 years ago." She said it the way she had said it for 4 years, flat and neat. A sentence meant to close something rather than open it. The kind of sentence that made the listener offer a shallow word of sympathy and move on to another subject. That was how she controlled it. If she kept it brief, people wouldn't ask more. And if they didn't ask more, she wouldn't have to hear herself tell the story again. But Deirdre didn't ask more. She didn't offer condolences either. She stood still for the length of a breath, one hand still resting on the desk, her eyes lowered toward the untouched coffee. Then she said 2 words. "I know." She said them very softly, almost as though she were speaking to herself, and she offered no explanation. She lifted her hand from the desk, adjusted the front of her jacket, and walked toward the elevators. Marin listened to the sound of her heels receding, heard the elevator chime, heard the doors close. Then the corridor fell silent. She remained seated, both hands still resting on the keyboard, and something very slow began crawling along her spine. "I know." People said those words when they had already heard. But Marin had never spoken about that in this building. She began tracing backward, carefully, as though turning one page at a time. 4 years on the night shift, and there had been no one to talk to at night. She had submitted her employment records through the service company, and on the emergency contact line she had written her brother's name, not her father's, because by then he was already gone. She had never told Gerald Pike, never told anyone in human resources, never told the woman from the morning cleaning crew whom she greeted whenever they passed. She had never spoken the name Emmett Halloway aloud anywhere within the building's 42 floors. She had never told Cormac either. She had thought about it through each of those first 7 nights, and she had decided she wouldn't. Yet a woman had just walked past her desk, set down a cup of coffee, asked 3 idle questions about a broken hot water dispenser, then listened as Marin spoke exactly 4 words about a dead man, and she hadn't asked when he died, hadn't asked how he died, hadn't asked where he died. Marin sat there for a very long time, trying to remember whether she had ever spoken her father's name inside this building, and with every passing minute, the answer became a little more certain. At 1 o'clock in the morning, the 42nd floor held only a single band of light spilling from Marin's desk lamp. She hadn't been able to sleep, and she had learned that when sleep wouldn't come, the best thing to do was work with her hands. So she had come upstairs to sort through 3 weeks of unanswered correspondence. Cormac's schedule clearly stated that he would be at Pier 7 until morning, and she had entered that line into the system herself. So when the elevator chimed at the far end of the hallway, she looked up with a file still in her hands. He passed her desk without stopping. He pushed open the office door, left the lights off, walked straight to the liquor cabinet in the corner, poured himself more whiskey than an ordinary person ordinarily would, and emptied it in a single swallow. Only then did he turn and see her standing in the doorway. One side of his jaw was swollen, and a bruise ran from his cheekbone down beneath his collar. A small split at the corner of his mouth had already dried. His coat was gone, and the right sleeve of his shirt had been torn open at the elbow. He offered no explanation. She didn't ask for one. She had worked nights in this building for 4 years, and she knew exactly which questions shouldn't be asked. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't think you were coming back. I'll go downstairs." She had turned half a step away when his voice came from behind her, rough and low. "Stay." Marin stopped. "Don't say anything," he said. "Just keep doing what you were doing." She stood still for several seconds. Every instinct she had acquired from 4 years of living at the edge of this city told her to go downstairs, lock the door, and pretend she had never come up here. People didn't remain in a room with a man who had returned looking like that, but she looked at him once more, at the way he set the glass on the cabinet without releasing it immediately, at the way his shoulders sagged when he thought no one was watching, and she realized she had seen that posture before. She had seen it in the mirror of the bathroom at Belhaven, on afternoons after signing the paperwork, and stepping into the hallway with no idea where she was supposed to go next. She walked back inside, switched on the lamp in the corner instead of the overhead lights, and continued sorting the mail. Cormac lowered himself into the chair behind his desk. He didn't turn on his computer, didn't take out any papers, didn't do anything at all. He rested both elbows on the desk and pressed his hands over his face. 30 minutes passed that way. During those 30 minutes, the only sounds in the room were paper sliding beneath Marin's hands, the opening and closing of the stapler, and the breathing of the man seated 4 steps away. She heard that breathing change 3 times. The first time, it was heavy and uneven. The second time, it slowed. The third time, it became almost too quiet to hear. She didn't turn around. She finished the entire stack, divided it into 3 piles, wrote a note for each one, and only then straightened and looked back. Cormac was asleep. His head had fallen onto his folded arm, his face turned inward, and the bruise along his jaw now lay in shadow. The second glass of whiskey he had poured remained untouched beside his elbow. Marin stood there for a while. She thought about calling someone. She thought about leaving him exactly as he was, and walking out. Then she moved around the desk very quietly, and reached over to switch off the lamp shining directly onto one side of his face. The room sank into the faint blue light rising from the harbor below. He didn't move. She walked out and closed the door behind her, and she did it so carefully that even the latch made no sound. The next morning, she reached the 42nd floor at 7 o'clock. The office door was open, the lights were on, and no one was inside. The glass had been washed and placed upside down on the tray. On her desk, positioned neatly between the keyboard and the schedule book, sat a small wooden box. It was old, the wood darkened and polished at the corners, and the hinge gave a dry creak when she opened it. Inside, resting on faded velvet, lay a black fountain pen with a plated ring worn thin around the barrel. Engraved into the side in small block letters, slightly crooked to the right because the engraver had been careless all those years ago, were 7 characters she had known by heart since before she could read the whole alphabet. E. Halloway. Marin couldn't remember when she had sat down. She only knew that sometime later she was sitting on the floor with her back against the side of the desk, the pen resting in her right palm. 3 years earlier, on a November morning, she had taken it to a pawn shop on Congress Street and received $320 for it. That money, added to everything else she had at the time, had been just enough to cover 1 month of Jonah's medical care. She had stood outside that pawn shop for 15 minutes before finding the courage to walk in, and she had never gone back because she knew she would never be able to redeem it. There was no note inside the box. There didn't need to be. But she sat on the floor with the pen in her hand, and for 10 full minutes, she couldn't make herself stand. Clearing out the old personnel filing cabinet was on the list of things that had been postponed for far too long on the 42nd floor, and Marin took the job because she needed something that would occupy both her hands. The fountain pen had remained in her desk drawer since that day, and she hadn't used it once or said a single word of thanks to Cormac, because she didn't know how anyone was supposed to thank someone for a thing like that. He never mentioned it either. He passed her desk every morning and said exactly what needed to be said. The bruise along his jaw faded from purple to yellow, and then disappeared, and no one in the building asked a single question. On Wednesday afternoon, she pulled open the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet and began sorting through old employment applications that should have been transferred to the archives 2 years earlier. She worked alphabetically, and when she reached the letter H, her hand stopped. The file bore her own name, Marin Halloway, contract employee through the service company, registered on September 12th, 4 years earlier. She opened it because she couldn't think of any reason not to. Inside was a copy of her identification from that time, the application she had filled out by hand at the service company's office, the emergency contact section listing Jonah's name, and a one-page personnel assessment prepared by Human Resources. She turned to the last page. In the lower right corner, beneath the space for the official stamp, there was a handwritten word in black ink, the strokes firm and slanting to the right. Approved. Beneath it was a signature. Maren had looked at that signature every day for the past 3 weeks. She had placed it on dozens of documents, had learned to recognize it from 6 feet away, and had noticed that he always carried the final stroke slightly beyond the printed line. She sat down on the floor among the scattered files and stared at it for a long time. A night shift contract worker hired through an outside service company didn't need the signature of the head of the corporation. No one on any of the building's 42 floors needed that signature. She went back through the other files, 20 of them, then 30, including those belonging to people who had worked the same shift as she had back then. None had a signature in the lower corner. None had a handwritten word. She closed the cabinet, picked up her file, and walked down the corridor. She knocked twice and pushed the door open without waiting. Cormac looked up from the papers in front of him. Maren placed the file on his desk, opened it to the final page, and turned it toward him. She said nothing. He looked down. He looked longer than an innocent man would have. "You signed my application," she said. "4 years ago. I was a night shift contract worker hired through a third-party service company. I checked 30 files in that cabinet, and not one of them had your signature. Not one." Cormac didn't answer immediately. He set down the pen in his hand very slowly, and that was what caught her attention, because he never did anything slowly. "You applied," he said. "I signed it. That's all you need to know. You didn't happen to find me in the storage room. I found you in the storage room because I went down to retrieve the shipping ledger. But I had been in this building for 4 years, and you knew my name before that night. You knew which shift I worked, knew I had never read a single page of the papers I destroyed. You told me you had checked." Cormac looked at her, and for several seconds he said nothing at all. Then he repeated the same sentence he had given her before, almost word for word, with the same rhythm and the same tone. "You applied. I signed it." And in that moment, Maren knew. She had spent 4 years in a city where everyone lied to her. Credit officers lied. Voss's men lied. Doctors lied by saying too little. She had learned how to hear it, and what she listened for wasn't the content but the rhythm. People telling the truth answered in different ways, because they were describing something real, something that could be seen from more than one side. People who lied repeated themselves exactly because they had only one sentence, and were afraid to stray from it. During the past 3 weeks, this man had never wasted a word on her. He interrupted her, ordered her, refused to explain himself to her, but he had never repeated himself. He had never looked at her for that long either, and his hand was resting flat on the desk with far too much care for a man who had nothing to hide. She picked up the file, closed it, and walked out. She said nothing more because she understood that if she asked again, he would repeat himself a 3rd time, and she didn't want to hear it a 3rd time. It was the first time she had ever seen him lie, and she realized that he was very bad at it. On Saturday afternoon, Maren arrived at Belhaven earlier than usual, because, for the first time in 4 years, she didn't have to hurry to another shift afterward. The front lobby was brightly lit and warmer than the air outside, and at the corner of the reception desk, a little girl of about 6 was sitting with a box of crayons, coloring on a stack of white paper. When the nurse on duty noticed Maren looking over, she explained that the child was her daughter, that the babysitter was busy that day, so she was sitting there waiting for her mother's shift to end, and that she was a very good girl who could stay occupied for hours as long as someone gave her a box of crayons. Maren signed the visitor log, accepted her badge, and while she was waiting for the elevator, the little girl slid down from her chair, ran over, and held out a sheet of paper. "You have orange hair," the girl said with absolute certainty, like someone who had finished a job and wouldn't tolerate an argument. On the page was a woman with 2 straight legs like sticks, a triangular dress, and a mass of bright orange hair that covered nearly half the paper. Maren took it and said thank you, and the girl smiled before running back to her mother. The nurse called after her with an apology, but Maren shook her head and said it was all right. She held the picture in her hand through all 4 floors of the elevator ride. In room 214, she peeled the adhesive strip from the edge of the paper and attached it to the door of the bedside cabinet, directly within sight if the person lying in the bed turned his head to the right. That block of orange was the only color in the entire room. She stepped back and looked at it for a while, and she realized that for 4 years, she had left her brother's room blank and white, like a sheet of paper no one had written on, and she didn't know whether that was because she had no time or because she was afraid. She pulled the chair closer and sat down, and she was about to open the newspaper when the nurse assigned to the floor came in for the routine examination. She had worked on that floor since Jonah's 2nd year there, and Maren had known her long enough to recognize when she had something she wanted to say. The nurse finished the examination, wrote on the chart, and only then turned back. "Something happened this week," she said. "We recorded several instances when the patient appeared to respond to sound. Not many, and the responses didn't occur consistently. But when there was a loud noise in the hallway, his eyelids moved, and on Tuesday, when I called his name, his heart rate changed for several seconds. We've informed the doctor, and they'll continue monitoring him." Maren sat perfectly still. The nurse added carefully that she didn't want Maren to misunderstand, that it didn't mean anything yet, that responses like those could appear and then disappear, and that 4 years was a very long time. "I understand," Maren said. She had memorized the way they spoke. For 4 years, every good sentence she heard had come with a warning attached to the end, and she had trained herself to hear only the warning, because the warning was the part that wouldn't make her collapse. But that afternoon, after the nurse had left and the door had closed, Maren sat looking at the mass of orange on the cabinet and allowed herself to hear the first part. His eyelids moved. His heart rate changed when someone called his name. She felt something rise inside her chest, something hot and painful, and she realized it was hope, and she realized she hadn't felt it in 4 years, because she had deliberately killed it every time it tried to lift its head. Hope was the most expensive thing someone like her could buy. It gave a person 1 good night of sleep, then took 10 nights away. She had done the arithmetic carefully and decided not to buy it, but that afternoon, she did. She pulled the chair closer, took her brother's hand, and began to speak. She told him there was a white sheet of paper with a 0 in the balance column, that the debt was gone, truly gone, not delayed, not restructured, but finished. She told him that beginning that month, someone else was paying for his care and would continue paying for as long as it was needed. She told him she had moved into a place with a window overlooking the harbor and that she slept 6 hours every night, sometimes 7. She told him that someone had found their father's pen and returned it to her without saying a single word. She told him everything was going to be all right, and for the first time in 4 years, she said those words without feeling as though she were lying to someone who was lying there. She told him about the man who had paid off their debt. She didn't tell him what that man did for a living. The archive box arrived on Monday morning, resting on a cart beside 4 others, and the man from operations said it was the last batch brought up from the basement as part of the review of old records. Maren signed for it and pushed the cart into the small side room beside her desk. The first 4 boxes contained exactly what their labels promised: warehouse leases and inspection reports for lifting equipment, documents that had passed their retention period and were only waiting to be fed into the shredder. The 5th box carried the same identifying code as the other 4, but when she lifted the lid, the papers inside were different. The stock was heavier, the pages were a different size, and metal fasteners held them together along the spine. She lifted the top sheet out of the reflex she had developed during 4 years on the night shift, not to read it, but to determine whether it belonged among the documents approved for destruction. At the top of the page, printed in an official administrative typeface, were 3 words: Harbor Point Warehouse. Maren went still. She had lived with those 3 words for 4 years, and she had never seen them printed on any document except the old newspaper articles she had stopped reading long ago. She sat down on the floor of the side room, placed the box between her knees, and began turning the pages. Floor plans, equipment inventories, routine inspection reports from the 3 preceding years. Then she reached a document titled Fire Protection System Acceptance Report, dated September 20th of that year, 3 weeks before the night the warehouse burned. In the conclusion section, a typed line stated that the system met all requirements and was approved for operation. At the lower right, beneath the title of Building Safety Inspector, was a signature: Emmett Halloway. Maren looked at the signature and felt nothing for 3 seconds. Then she felt everything. Her father hadn't signed that document. She knew it not because she was guessing, not because she was his daughter, but because 3 weeks before he died, he had sat at their kitchen table with an envelope in his hand and given it to her. Inside was a copy of a 2-page letter he had sent to the project management board, clearly stating that he refused to approve the Harbor Point Warehouse fire suppression system, because the pipe pressure in the eastern section was inadequate, and because 2 fire hydrants had been blocked by improperly stacked cargo. He told her to put it somewhere safe. She remembered his exact words. "Keep this for me. Put it away. Don't give it to anyone, in case something happens." She had asked what might happen. He said nothing would, then changed the subject, and 3 weeks later, something did. For 4 years, that letter had remained inside an envelope, wedged between 2 books in the cardboard box she hadn't opened since moving to the 41st floor. For 4 years, it had been useless. She had taken it to 2 law offices during the first year, and both had told her the same thing, that a letter refusing approval proved nothing, because someone could refuse on one day and sign the next after the contractor corrected the problems, and that without the original acceptance report for comparison, there was nothing to pursue. No one had ever found the original report. It wasn't in the case file, wasn't at the department, wasn't anywhere. It was only cited in the investigative conclusion, and that conclusion contained a single sentence stating that the responsible inspector had approved the system 3 weeks before the incident, and that sentence had turned her father from a man who died in a fire into a name people lowered their voices when they mentioned. Marin sat on the floor of the side room among the cardboard boxes, holding the report in both trembling hands, and understood that she had just found the missing half. Placed beside each other, those 2 documents were no longer a meaningless refusal. They were a refusal followed by a signature on the same system and the same work item, with no corrective action report between them. She searched through the entire box, page by page, her hands shaking so badly that she tore the edge of one sheet. There was no corrective action report, no record of reconstruction, nothing at all. There was only the refusal she had kept on the 41st floor and this document. She sat motionless for a very long time, and then another thought rose inside her, slow and cold, growing until it filled the entire room. This document wasn't at the department. It wasn't in the case file. No one had found it in 4 years. It was sitting in the archives of the man who had just paid off her debt. Marin carried the report to her desk and placed it beneath the light. She meant to look at the signature one more time, only one more time, and then she would decide what to do. But she didn't look at the signature. She looked at the small handwritten line in the left margin, the routine notation every records clerk added to mark a document's storage status. 3 brief words, stating that the original had been transferred to the archives. She had been staring at that line for 3 seconds when her hand moved automatically to the left, toward the schedule book that always lay open beside her. That book had been the first thing given to her when she moved to the 42nd floor. It contained Cormac's entire fixed schedule for 6 months, and it had been written by hand from the first page to the last, because the person who created it didn't trust computers, and that person was Deirdre Kavanagh. Marin placed the 2 pages side by side, the same slant, leaning slightly to the right, a little too sharply for someone who wrote slowly, the same way of forming the letters G and Y, the tails drawn downward and then curved back up into a small hook that very few people still used, the same way of writing the number 4, open at the top, and on both pages, the writer lifted the pen midway through the same stroke, leaving a very thin break between the horizontal line and the vertical one. Marin sat still, both hands resting flat on either side of the paper. Inside her mind, a very calm voice reminded her that similar handwriting proved nothing, that she wasn't an expert, that thousands of people wrote with a rightward slant. She let the voice finish. Then she turned 6 more pages in the schedule book and found 4 more matching details, and the voice fell silent. She sat there for a long time. Then she did something she could never explain afterward, something she didn't know why she had chosen to do at that exact moment. She turned on the computer and signed into the company's payment system, where all of Jonah's nursing expenses had been transferred beginning the month before. She wanted to see whether that month's payment had gone through. It had. But in the reconciliation section, the system displayed the patient's payment history for the previous 4 years, and Marin saw a column she had never seen on any of the paper invoices Belhaven sent her. Every month, beside the amount she paid, there was a second payment. It wasn't large, roughly 1/5 of the total cost. It appeared regularly beginning in the 2nd month after Jonah was admitted, with not a single month missing. Not even the months when she was 11 days late. Not even that November when she took her father's pen to the pawn shop on Congress Street. The source column listed a Belhaven long-term patient assistance fund. Marin had heard of funds like that. During the first year, she had applied twice, and had been rejected both times because Jonah's case didn't fall within the priority group. She had assumed the monthly difference came from a reduction granted by the facility, and she had been grateful for it in the way people were grateful for good weather. She clicked on the name of the fund. A registration entry opened. The fund was named after a woman, her full name written out, a name Maren had never heard in her life. She stared at it, and a faint, uncertain sensation began tugging at the back of her neck. The feeling of someone who had just passed a familiar face, without remembering where they had seen it. She opened the old personnel filing cabinet, the one she had sorted through to the letter H the week before, and then stopped. She pulled out the index drawer and turned to the letter K. Deirdre Kavanaugh's file was the thickest in the entire drawer, 30 years of records, and on the first page, beneath personal information, there was a small line listing her maiden name. Maren read it, then she read it again. Then she turned toward the screen and compared each letter one by one, even though she already knew. The same name. She pushed her chair back from the desk and sat upright, both arms hanging at her sides, her eyes fixed on the empty space between the two monitors. 4 years. The woman who had put pen to paper and turned her father into a man who took money to sign whatever was placed before him. The woman who had allowed his name to remain in every newspaper article, every record, every conversation spoken in lowered voices. The woman who had stood beside Maren's desk the week before, holding a cup of coffee and asking 3 harmless questions about the hot water dispenser, was also the same woman who, every month, without missing a single one, had paid part of the nursing expenses for the younger brother lying in room 214. Not once. Not one large payment meant to settle the matter and be done with it. Every month, for 48 months, for someone who would never know, from a name she herself had left behind 20 years earlier. Maren sat there in the empty corridor of the 42nd floor and tried to find a word for what she had just seen. It wasn't kindness. It wasn't exactly guilt either. Maren went down to the 41st floor at 9 o'clock that night, opened the cardboard box she hadn't touched since the day she moved in, and took out the envelope wedged between 2 books. She carried it back to the 42nd floor with the report, the schedule book, and a printed copy of Belhaven's 4-year payment history. She knocked twice and pushed the door open. Cormac was standing at the window with his back to her. He turned at the sound of the door, saw her, then lowered his eyes to the stack of papers in her hands. And he didn't ask a single question. Maren walked to the desk and placed each item down slowly, in order, like someone laying out evidence rather than someone who had come seeking answers. Her father's letter refusing approval. The report bearing the forged signature. The schedule book open to the page with 4 matching details. The printout showing 48 payments. Then she straightened and looked at him. "How long have you known?" She asked it very softly. She wasn't crying. Her voice was flat, every word clear, and she heard herself as though she were listening to someone else. And she understood that this was the frightening part, because over the past 4 years she had learned that when a person stopped trembling, it meant they had already passed the place where they could still be saved. Cormac didn't look down at the papers. He looked directly into her face. 4 years, he said. Maren gave one small nod, as though she had just been given a figure in a price estimate. "Tell me." And he did. He didn't sit down, didn't pour himself anything, didn't lower his voice to make the truth easier to hear. He said that during the autumn of that year, a shipment belonging to Rourke Maritime had been stored at Harbor Point Warehouse under a customs deadline that couldn't be delayed, that the warehouse needed an approved fire protection report in order to remain operational, and that the inspector responsible had refused to sign it. He said that the inspector had conducted 2 inspections, had clearly documented that the pipe pressure in the eastern section was inadequate, and that 2 fire hydrants were blocked by improperly stacked cargo, and had submitted a written refusal to the project management board. He said that 3 days later, an approval report appeared bearing the inspector's signature, and the inspector knew nothing about it. Then he paused for a moment and delivered the rest in the same even voice. 3 weeks later, the Zaleski family sent men to burn the warehouse for the insurance money because the cargo inside didn't belong to them, while the insurance on the property did. They didn't know the fire protection system had failed inspection. They believed it had passed because there was a report. 3 men were working the night shift inside the warehouse. 2 made it out. Your father went back in. He didn't come out again. Maren stood motionless. She had read the investigative conclusion dozens of times during the first year, and not one word in it said that her father had gone back inside. It contained only a single sentence stating that the responsible inspector had approved the system 3 weeks before the fire, and that sentence had lived longer than he had. "And my brother," she said. Cormac was silent. "He was working security in that district at night," she continued, her voice still flat. "He was 20 years old. He ran inside looking for our father. They pulled him out, but it was too late. He hasn't spoken a single word in 4 years. "I know," Cormac said. "Who forged the signature?" He didn't answer. She asked again, the same question in the same voice. He still didn't answer. Marin looked down at the open schedule book on the desk, then back at him, and she saw that he had noticed it, that he understood exactly what she had compared and whom she had compared it to, and he was still choosing silence. She left the question lying between them. Then she asked the only one that remained. "Why did you approve my job application?" 4 years ago. 3 months after my father died, I applied through a service company for a night shift position destroying documents, and the head of this corporation personally put his signature on a page no one needed him to sign. "Why?" Cormac looked at her for a long time. When he spoke, his voice didn't change, but something in its rhythm broke apart. "I couldn't give your father back," he said. "I couldn't reopen the case without dragging everything else into it. Do you know what reopening it would mean? It would mean an investigation into everything I'm holding together. It would mean war with the Zaleskis directly on the docks. It would mean the people who work for me losing more than their names. I weighed it 4 years ago, and I made my choice. I gave you a job and a door to walk through every day, somewhere you could remain standing. That was all I could do without breaking everything." Marin listened to all of it. She heard the entire answer without interrupting him, and when he finished, she remained exactly where she was for several more seconds. Then she walked around the desk and stopped in front of him. He didn't step back. She took his left hand, the hand she had awakened 4 weeks earlier to find her own fingers closed around, and pulled the silver ring from his little finger. He allowed her to do it. She placed it on the desk between her father's letter and the report bearing a signature that wasn't his, and the sound of metal touching wood was very small in that room. "Then you did nothing at all," she said. She walked out, descended 42 floors, and stepped straight into the rain. Cormac didn't touch the ring for 2 hours after she left. It lay on the desk between the 2 documents, and he sat staring at it until the door opened without a knock. Deirdre walked in, looked down at the desk, and looked long enough to see everything lying there. She didn't ask where Marin had found them. She didn't pretend not to understand. She pulled out the chair opposite him and sat down, and it was the first time in 30 years that she had taken a seat in that room without being invited. "You forged his signature," Cormac said. "Yes," Deirdre said. She said it the way someone confirmed an expense in a ledger. "You want me to tell you all of it? Then I will. Your father was upstairs by then and no longer capable of making decisions. And you were 29 years old and didn't yet understand what you were sitting on. The shipment inside Harbor Point warehouse was worth 3 months of operations for the entire southern route. If it didn't clear customs on time, it stayed where it was. And if it stayed, customs broke the seal. And if customs broke the seal, 30 people lost their jobs, and 4 people lost much more than that. The Zaleskis had been waiting 2 years for exactly that moment. A delayed shipment isn't just a delayed shipment, Cormac. It's a war. I had 4 days to find a way through it, and what I found was a piece of paper that needed a signature no one was willing to give." She paused. "For 20 years, I paid many prices for your family," she said. "Some of those prices I still carry on my body. That signature was the cheapest of them. I thought it was a piece of paper, nothing more than a piece of paper. I thought that if the fire protection system was faulty, they would repair it later, and that the worst thing that could happen was the cargo getting wet. And I calculated everything except one thing. I didn't know the Zaleskis were going to burn it. Had I known, I wouldn't have signed, not because I'm good, but because setting fire to a warehouse containing our cargo was something I would have stopped from the beginning. I didn't know, and I didn't know someone would go back inside that night." She spoke the final sentence more slowly than the 2 before it. Cormac remained still. He had lived for 4 years with what he knew, and he realized that in all those 4 years, he had never once sat in the same room with this woman and allowed the whole story to be spoken. He had avoided it like a door inside his own home. "What does she have?" Deirdre asked. "Enough," Cormac said. "Enough for what?" "Enough to reopen the case." Deirdre nodded slowly. She looked toward the window, where the rain was running in long streaks down the glass, and when she spoke again, her voice wasn't louder or colder. and nothing in it changed at all, and that was what made the words so heavy. "You know there are problems that simply need to disappear," she said. "We've done it many times before, and you've never once asked me how." "No," Cormac said. She turned to look at him. "No," he repeated. "Why?" He opened his mouth, and nothing came out. He had 5 answers ready, and all 5 were true, and none of them was the truth. He could say she was keeping the documents somewhere he didn't know. He could say she was the only person who had access to his schedule. He could say an investigation was already hanging over Pier 7 and this wasn't the time. He said none of those things. He sat there with both hands resting flat on the desk. And he remained silent for exactly 3 seconds. And those 3 seconds were the longest thing in the room all evening. Deirdre watched him through them. Then she stood. "You're like your father in many ways," she said. "But he never let me see the soft place." She walked out and closed the door very gently. Cormac sat for a while longer. Then he opened the bottom drawer on the left, took the key from the tin box, and held it in his hand for a long time before slipping it into his coat pocket. He found Maren in the last apartment at the end of the 41st floor hallway close to midnight. She opened the door with her hair still wet and her coat hanging over the back of the chair, and she didn't invite him inside, and he didn't step across the threshold. He stood in the doorway and placed 2 things on the writing desk just inside: a blank sheet of paper and the black fountain pen with 7 crooked characters engraved into its barrel. "Write down what you want to happen to her," he said. "Anything. Whatever you write, I'll do exactly that." Maren looked down at the paper. She understood perfectly well what he meant. She had worked nights in that building for 4 years, and she knew what kinds of things had been written on the pages she fed into the shredder. She thought of room 214. She thought of 48 lines of payments, 1 every month, including that November. She thought of the woman who had stood beside her desk holding a cup of coffee and said 2 words. "I know." She picked up the pen. She removed the cap, and there was still ink in the nib, and she wrote 3 words in the center of the blank page before turning it toward him. "Tell the truth." Cormac didn't take the page with those 3 words to any office. He knew exactly what happened when the head of an organization walked through the front door of a government agency carrying a file in his hands. And it wasn't justice. It was 4 years spent answering questions while Pier 7 changed owners. So he did it the only way he knew how. On Monday morning, a thick envelope with no return address was placed in the mailbox of the local newspaper's editorial office. Inside were copies of the letter refusing approval, the report bearing the signature, and a single typed page listing 3 dates side by side without any commentary. That same afternoon, a law office in Back Bay submitted a petition to the state fire marshal's office, requesting that the Harbor Point warehouse fire investigation be reopened, filed on behalf of an anonymous client, in full accordance with procedure. Cormac Rourke's name didn't appear on a single line of either action, but there were 3 people inside the organization who knew exactly where it had come from, and he knew who all 3 were, and he spent most of the first night calculating which one of them would speak first. Nothing happened on the 2nd day. On the 3rd day, the investigation appeared on the front page. Maren read it in a laundromat on Broadway, where she had sat waiting for dryers for 4 years and had read countless newspapers from that exact chair. She saw her father's name in the headline, read the article from beginning to end, then read it a second time, and halfway through the second reading, she realized she had risen to her feet without knowing when. She stood in the middle of the laundromat with the newspaper in her hands, surrounded by the steady turning of dryers and the smell of fabric softener, and she didn't cry, didn't sit down, didn't do anything at all. She only stood there. For 4 years, she had carried that name through every reception desk, every human resources office, every interview where someone looked down at her application and then looked up at her once more. For 4 years, she had trained herself to say it in a flat, clipped voice, so no one would ask another question. Now it was printed in bold letters across the front page, and the sentence following it wasn't the one she had memorized. During the 2nd week, the state fire marshal's office issued an official notice, withdrawing the portion of its conclusion concerning the responsibility of the assigned inspector, stating that the acceptance report used as evidence had been determined not to have been created by the person whose name appeared on it. One administrative sentence, 17 words long, without a single adjective. Maren read it on the computer screen on the 42nd floor, read it exactly once, and closed it, because she knew that if she read it a second time, she wouldn't be able to work. That same week, the district attorney's office announced the convening of a grand jury to reconsider the cause of the fire, and Tobias Zaleski's name appeared on the list of investigative subjects for the first time in 4 years. At Pier 7, everything became quiet in the particular way Cormac had learned to read when he was 15 years old. No one called. No one came to see him. Not a single word arrived from the southern harbor. He increased the number of men assigned to the night watch and offered no explanation, and no one asked for one. During that week, he passed Marin every day in the corridor on the 42nd floor, and the two of them exchanged no more than 10 sentences. She continued doing her work. He continued leaving the silver ring exactly where she had placed it on his desk, and he didn't put it back on. Deirdre Kavanagh hadn't returned to the building since the 3rd day. Her mailbox slowly filled. No one sat in her chair in the 42nd floor conference room. Gerald Pike asked once whether her schedule should be reassigned, and Cormac told him to leave it as it was. On the 11th night, he sat alone in his dark office, looking down at the line of motionless cranes beneath the yellow lights of the southern harbor. The phone on his desk lit up. It didn't ring. He looked at the screen and saw her name. The message contained only 2 words. Your father. Marin went up to the 41st floor that evening, but not to collect her belongings. She had been thinking since morning, and she had thought it through very carefully, and she knew what she wanted. She wanted to stand in front of that woman and ask one question, not why she had forged the signature, because someone had already answered that question for her, but why she had paid for 48 months on behalf of someone who would never know. Marin had written 3 words on the blank sheet of paper, and she had remained true to those 3 words, but she still needed to hear the answer from Deirdre's own mouth. Deirdre Kavanagh wasn't in the building. She hadn't been there that day, or the day before. Her desk remained untouched. Her mailbox was full, and no one had disturbed her chair in the conference room. Marin went downstairs and asked at reception, and they told her Deirdre hadn't used her badge to enter the building since Tuesday morning of the previous week. She returned to the last apartment at the end of the 41st floor hallway and sat on the edge of the bed in darkness for a very long time, and beyond the window, the storm that had been gathering all day finally broke open. Rain struck the glass sideways in waves. The lights of the southern harbor blurred into distorted yellow halos. She didn't sleep. At 2:15 in the morning, thunder cracked directly above the building, and immediately afterward, in the silence that followed, she heard the private elevator start moving. Marin knew that sound. During 4 weeks of working on the 42nd floor, she had learned that the private elevator only ran when one person used it, and that person never traveled with anyone. She opened her door slightly and stepped into the hallway. The elevator doors slid apart at the far end. Cormac came out, and he wasn't walking. He was dragging himself forward. His left shoulder pressed against the elevator wall to give him momentum, and when he pulled away from it, he had to reach out and brace himself against the wall. His coat was gone. The left side of his white shirt was soaked dark, and the stain was spreading downward with gravity. And it wasn't rainwater. He managed 3 steps before stopping to lean against the wall, leaving a streak across the wallpaper, and then he looked up and saw her standing in the middle of the hallway. Go back to your room, he said. His voice was no longer rough. It was thin. Marin didn't go back to her room. She moved toward him quickly, reached out with both hands, then stopped halfway because she didn't know where she could touch him without causing more pain. I'll call security. I'll call Pike. No, he said. Lock the elevator. She looked at him for 1 second, then ran to the control panel at the end of the hallway, entered the floor lock code, and heard the heavy sound of the mechanism closing inside the elevator shaft. When she turned back, he had dragged himself several more steps and was leaning against the frame of his door. She slipped her shoulder beneath his right arm, and he allowed her to do it, and she realized he was much heavier than she had imagined, and she had to grip the doorframe to keep both of them from falling. She managed to get him inside and lowered him onto the edge of the bed. He sat folded forward, one hand pressed tightly against his side, breathing in short bursts through clenched teeth. What did Zaleski do? Marin asked. She was searching for the light switch and spoke without turning around. It was the only explanation that made sense. A grand jury had been convened. His name was on the list, and if there was one man in the city who wanted Cormac Rourke to stop breathing, it was Tobias Zaleski. She had arranged the entire sequence in her mind before she even asked. Cormac shook his head. She found the switch and turned on the light, and beneath it, she saw more clearly than she wanted to. She knelt in front of him. It wasn't him, Cormac said. Then who was it? He raised his head. His face was deathly pale, and a line of rainwater still ran down his temple. and he looked at her exactly the way he had looked at her that first morning in the white room on the 42nd floor, fully and without looking away. She did it herself. Maren didn't understand immediately. For 2 seconds, her mind refused to place those words where they belonged. Then it did. "She was sitting in the back seat of my car," Cormac said. "She had been sitting in the back seat of my car since I was 15 years old. 40 minutes. She asked me why. I couldn't answer her that time either. Because of the money," Maren said, and she heard her voice break on the final word. It wasn't about the money. For 30 years, she held everything together, and last week I chose someone whose name I had only known for 4 weeks. She didn't need me to explain myself to anyone else. She only needed me to explain myself to her, and I stood there in silence. For someone like her, silence costs more than any answer. Maren reached for the telephone on the bedside cabinet. Her right hand had already pressed 2 numbers when a hand closed around her wrist and stopped her. There was no strength in the grip, but he didn't let go. The doctors belonged to her. Maren set the telephone down. For 2 seconds, she remained seated on the floor, and during those 2 seconds, her mind ran through every possibility and discarded them one by one. No elevator, no security, no doctor. That left only her. She stood, and her voice changed, and she heard that change as though someone else were speaking. It was the voice she had used at the Bellhaven financial desk during the first year, the voice of someone who no longer had time to be afraid. "Is there a medical kit anywhere?" "Under the sink," Cormac said. "In the bathroom." She found it there. A heavy black canvas bag packed so tightly that the zipper strained against its seams. She dragged it into the room and set it on the floor in front of him. "Take off your shirt." He lifted his hands to the buttons, but his fingers slipped and couldn't manage them. And he tried a second time before giving up. Maren seized both sides of the shirt and pulled hard, and the buttons tore free and rolled across the floor. She stripped the wet fabric from his shoulders and threw it aside. She looked once, only once, long enough to know what she had to do, and then she didn't look again. "I don't know how to stitch a wound," she said. "You don't need to," he said. "Clean it, apply pressure, seal it. Just stop the bleeding." She opened the bag. Everything inside had been arranged in rows, with a kind of ruthless precision. And she understood immediately that someone had prepared this kit for a night exactly like this one, and left it beneath the sink for years, waiting to be used. She took out the bottle of saline, tore open a stack of gauze, and knelt in front of him. "This is going to hurt. Do it." She poured. His entire body went rigid. He didn't cry out. He clenched his teeth, and a low, ragged sound broke from somewhere deep inside his chest, while his right hand seized the edge of the bed, the knuckles turning white beneath his skin. Maren locked her jaw and pressed the entire stack of gauze against the wound, then drove the weight of her upper body down through both hands. "Breathe," she said. "Keep breathing. Don't pass out. I can't lift you." His head dropped forward, and his forehead came to rest against her shoulder, his breath hot and uneven through the thin fabric of her blouse. Then the 10 minutes began. Outside, the storm struck without pause, and every time thunder broke, the entire window frame shuddered and fell still again. Inside the room, there were only 2 rhythms of breath. His was heavy and broken, and whenever it slowed for too long, she called his name, and it quickened again. Hers was short and shallow, and she couldn't control it. Her hands were wet and slippery, and twice she had to change her grip without easing the pressure. During those 10 minutes, her mind was completely empty, and then it wasn't. She thought of a night in October 4 years earlier, of the telephone call close to 1 o'clock in the morning, of the man's voice on the other end, asking whether she was a relative of Mr. Emmett Holloway, of the way she had lowered herself onto the kitchen floor with the receiver pressed to her ear, and hadn't asked him to repeat the question, because she had already known. For 4 years, she had lived with the thought that she had been 4 miles away that night and couldn't do anything. There had been nothing to do, no one to reach for, only a telephone call and a cold kitchen floor. But what lay beneath her hands tonight didn't belong to 4 years ago. It was here, in this room, within the reach of one hand, and it was alive. And whether it remained alive depended on whether she lifted her hands. She didn't lift them. She pressed down, counted each of his breaths, and refused to let herself think about anything else. At the 10th minute, she eased the pressure slowly and waited. The gauze didn't darken any further. She released a breath she hadn't known she was holding. She completed the rest in order. Adhesive, sealing strips, then a compression bandage wrapped tightly around his body and secured in place. When she tied the final knot, her hands began to shake, and they shook so violently that she had to close them into fists. She moved back and dropped heavily onto the floor, her spine against the side of the bed, and covered her face with both hands because she didn't want him to see. Cormac remained bent forward on the edge of the bed, breathing, and he could breathe. No color had returned to his face, but each breath was longer and steadier than before. He looked down and saw her shoulders trembling. He reached toward her, very slowly, took hold of both her wrists, and drew her hands away from her face. "Look at me," he said. Maren raised her eyes. "You did well." A wet, broken laugh escaped her, and at last the tears began to fall. "I just didn't want to have to write your death report." Inside the black canvas bag was a partially used blister pack of painkillers, and Maren made him swallow 2 tablets with half a glass of water, even though he shook his head twice before giving in. Then she went to wash her hands. She turned on the hot water and scrubbed them until the skin reddened, and she stood watching the water spiral down the drain longer than necessary because she wasn't ready to go back. When she returned, he was still sitting in the same position on the edge of the bed, his back slightly bowed, his eyes fixed on some point along the opposite wall. She took a damp cloth and wiped away the dried rainwater and the streaks of dirt along his temple and jaw. He let her. His eyes followed her hand with a slow, heavy concentration, the kind of focus belonging to someone who was slipping downward but wasn't yet willing to admit it. "You need to lie down," she said. "If I lie down," Cormac said, and his voice had begun to blur at the end of each word, "I won't be able to get up if something happens. The elevator is locked. The floor entrance is locked. No one can come up here tonight." He was silent for a while. The medicine was loosening the strained lines in his face little by little, and along with them, the layers of defense that had kept this man standing upright for 7 months were beginning to slide away. "That isn't what I mean," he said. "If I close my eyes, everything collapses. All of it. Do you know how many people are waiting for me to close my eyes?" Maren looked at him. Something inside her chest tightened with a sharp and unfamiliar pain, and she realized that for 4 years, she had built a very thick wall to keep herself from feeling exactly this. She had believed the man sitting before her belonged to an entirely different kind of life, that he lived on another level of the city beneath a different kind of gravity. But she had heard those words before. She had spoken them to herself at the end of the month, on nights when the Belhaven bill arrived, and she sat at the kitchen table afraid to lie down because she feared that if she slept, everything would fall apart by morning. She and he had been built from the same thing. He simply wore a better suit. "It won't collapse," she said. She reached out, placed her palm on his uninjured shoulder, and pushed, gently but firmly. "I'm here. I'll watch the door." He resisted for exactly 1 beat. Then the strength to resist ran out of him, and he allowed her to ease him backward. A hiss escaped him when his back touched the mattress, his face tightening before settling into a pale expression of complete exhaustion. Maren pulled the blanket up over his chest. She turned away to gather the black canvas bag and the torn fabric scattered across the floor. And as she turned, she had already prepared herself for a hand to close around her wrist. It didn't. Instead, she felt his fingers touch the center of her right palm and place something small, round, and cold inside it. Then he folded her fingers around it one by one, slowly, until her hand was closed. He said nothing. Maren opened her hand and looked down. The plain silver ring rested in her palm. The circle of metal she had awakened 4 weeks earlier to find her fingers wrapped around, the same circle of metal she had pulled from his little finger 11 days earlier and placed on the desk between 2 documents. She looked up. His eyes were already half closed, and he offered no explanation, and she understood that he never would because this man had never told the truth about anything through words. She closed her hand around the ring. She stood there for a long time. Then she looked at the wooden door, at the dark stain on the hallway wallpaper that she would have to deal with in the morning, at the man lying on the bed and struggling to keep his eyes open for 1 more minute because he didn't believe the world would remain intact if he stopped watching it. She thought of the armchair pulled close to the bed in the white room on the 42nd floor, and of a man who had sat there through an entire night without pulling his hand away. Maren took off her shoes. She set the ring on the bedside cabinet, climbed onto the mattress, and lay on her side at the opposite edge, leaving enough space between them that she wouldn't touch the compression bandage. She didn't pull any of the blanket over herself. "Go to sleep, Cormac." It was the first time she had called him by his name. He didn't answer, but in the darkness, She heard the ragged breathing beside her begin to slow, then deepen, then stretch into a steady rhythm she had never once heard from this man during the 4 weeks she had worked 1 floor away from his room. It was the first real sleep he had known in 7 months. Maren lay still with her eyes open, staring at the dark ceiling, and realized that she didn't want to leave this room. Maren woke at 6 o'clock, and the man beside her was still asleep. She lay still for several minutes, listening to that deep, even breathing, then slipped quietly out of bed, pulled the blanket higher over him, and placed the silver ring in his open left palm before leaving. She stopped at the corner shop to buy the newspaper, then took the number 7 bus, as she had done for 4 years. Inside her purse was the newspaper from 2 weeks earlier, the one with her father's name on the front page, and she had kept it smooth and uncreased as though it were a piece of identification. At Belhaven, the drawing with the mass of orange hair was still attached to the bedside cabinet in room 214. The nurse in charge of the floor was waiting for her at the door, and she asked Maren to sit before she began speaking. And Maren knew that when people asked you to sit down, what they were about to say was never something small. The nurse explained that during the past 10 days, the care team had been trying a simple communication process with the patient, that at first there had only been scattered responses, but over the past 3 days, they had become consistent. The patient blinked once when the answer was yes. She said the doctor had tested it twice and confirmed that the response was intentional. Maren lowered herself into the familiar plastic chair and had to place both hands on her knees to keep them from shaking. She leaned forward and called her brother's name. "Jonah, it's me. If you can hear me, blink once." She waited. 3 seconds passed, longer than any 3 seconds she had lived through in 4 years, and then his eyelids closed and opened again, firmly, once. Maren raised a hand to cover her mouth. The nurse placed one hand on her shoulder and remained that way without saying anything. When Maren was able to breathe again, she took out the newspaper and read the article to him from the headline to the final line, slowly, 1 sentence at a time. And when she finished, she told him that their father's name had been cleared, that the old conclusion had been withdrawn, that anyone who searched the records now would see only the truth. She asked whether he understood. 1 blink. Then she sat in silence for a long time, because the next question was the one she hadn't dared to ask in 4 years. "Do you remember that night?" 1 blink. "Did you see anyone there?" 1 blink. The nurse brought out an alphabet board, a plastic sheet printed with rows of letters that the care team used, and she showed Maren how to move through each row and each column, pausing to wait for the signal. The 40 minutes that followed were the slowest 40 minutes Maren had ever lived. She moved, stopped, and waited. She wrote each character on the back of the newspaper with her father's fountain pen, the first character, the second. By the 4th, her hand had begun to shake, and she had to set the pen down for a while. By the 6th, Jonah closed his eyes and didn't open them again because he was exhausted, and the nurse said that was enough for 1 day, that they would continue tomorrow. Maren looked down at the back of the newspaper. 6 characters were written there in the ink strokes of a man who had been dead for 4 years, forming a name she had heard every day for the past 4 weeks, the name engraved on the brass sign in the lobby of the 42-story building, the name of the man sleeping his first true sleep in 7 months on the 41st floor. She sat motionless. Then she remembered something she had skimmed over in the thickest personnel file in the K drawer, a line noting funeral benefits paid 8 years earlier to a relative of the Rourke family. Cormac Rourke had an older brother. That brother had been declared dead 8 years ago. Maren Holloway's story stops here, but perhaps you, like me, understand that it hasn't truly ended. Some people don't need anyone to save them. They only need someone to remain long enough for them to dare close their eyes. And sometimes that is the greatest gift one human being can give another. True kindness rarely announces its own name. It arrives as a fountain pen redeemed and left quietly on a desk, a lamp switched off so someone else can sleep, a door guarded through the night by someone who asks for nothing in return. And the honor of someone who has died will always be worth what we must sacrifice for it, because as long as one survivor remembers the truth about them, that person has never completely disappeared. If today's story touched you, please leave a like, subscribe to our channel, and share this video so that each day you can have more meaningful stories to listen to. Tell us how you feel about Maren, about Cormac, and about the choices they made by leaving a comment below, because we truly hope to hear what is in the deepest part of your heart. May you and your family always have abundant health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.